All right, welcome to another episode of Litigious, a podcast dedicated to keeping you in the know about legal issues and lawsuits in the news, cutting through all of the misleading headlines and letting you know what these things are really about. Reminder that this podcast is brought to you by Durazio Peterson, an employment and personal injury law firm in New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont. And if you have any questions, go to our website, duraziopeterson.com. If you have questions for the podcast, hit us up on the socials, Instagram, send us a message. We're happy to answer it at litigious. And that's all. Oh, if you like the show, please subscribe, like, five-star reviews, share with a friend. That's the best thing you can do to help promote the show. I am Scott Peterson. Giovanna is here with me today, as usual. Anything to add before we get into it?
I'm sitting next to my RBG portrait in honor of this week being the anniversary of the Supreme Court overruling Roe versus Wade. So she's angry and
Okay. All right.
my
Well, all right. It's a good poster. Um,
parents gave this to me when we opened our own office.
yeah, they did.
Nice.
All right. So, well, speaking of litigation, we can start this week with I guess, bombshell lawsuit against billionaire media mogul Tyler Perry, who is being sued by a former male employee for $260 million in a sexual assault and harassment lawsuit that was filed in a couple weeks ago. So, backstory here is if you haven't heard of Tyler Perry, you're probably living under a rock. Tyler Perry has started and built out multiple franchises, including Medea, um, shows like Duplicity and Sisters, all kinds of Netflix shows. He's got a major studio. As I said, I believe he's a billionaire. Um, and he's being sued by a former employee who says that he first met Tyler Perry when he was working at an opening party for Tyler Perry's studio. Um, Perry then encouraged him to start acting, offered him roles in some of his shows, which he accepted. And then, according to the lawsuit, unwanted advances began. And there's some kind of bombshell type allegations here. One is that one evening there was a party, and uh, the employee, whose last name is Dixon, had too much to drink, so he stayed over at Tyler Perry's house and went to bed in his underwear and woke up to Perry having snuck in his bed and rubbing his body around his thigh. Um, Another incident where he alleges that at Tyler Perry's house, um, Perry encouraged him to try a weight monitor in the guest bedroom and asked him to undress. And then Perry pulled his underwear down and grabbed his butt and told him to relax and just let it happen.
Wait, a weight monitor? What is that?
Yeah,
Like
I
a
assume some kind of a
scale?
scale. Yeah. And then apparently asked him all kinds of sexual questions, asked him about his sexual preferences. Um, as you might imagine, Perry's camp has come out and adamantly denied this and has called this a shakedown. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was that in response, Dixon's lawyers simply said, apparently they haven't seen the text messages. And there are apparently a slew of text messages, at least that's what's been reported, where Perry asks him things like, what is it going to take for you to have guiltless sex? Um, you're missing the best years of your life. I hope that you would I would hope that you would let someone hold you and make love to you. Uh, and so, long story short, that's what's happening. They're denying it, but Perry's lawyer's response was, you really shouldn't come out and take this aggressive a position in the media if you haven't actually looked at the evidence. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so this would be kind of a quid pro quo sexual harassment case, the way it's described. I think most people know what quid pro quo means, but in translated from Latin, it's something for something or this for that. So it's the term that we use for sexual harassment cases where it's basically, the boss is sort of propositioning you or making you promises in return for basically sexual favors. So when I was reading this, I thought it was a little bit similar. Some of the way he described what was going on reminded me of the allegations that Alex Cooper was making against her former coach. I think in this Tyler Perry situation, allegedly, it's like eventually got to the point where it was much more overtly sexual in nature. But you can kind of see, I think, a progression in these types of cases of what people think they're going to get away with. And it sort of started off very similar to the way Alex Cooper described it, of starting to ask like inappropriate questions and sort of probing questions about your sex life, and then becoming jealous. And then it kind of continued in this situation sort of from there to allegations of, physical assault and things like that. So, I mean, I guess it seems pretty early, and, they have Tyler Perry. I think it's usually the most sort of common response in these types of situations, which is basically that I'm the victim of like either like a social climber or somebody who was looking to be in my movies or in my TV shows. Cause I think this guy ended up getting a regular role on a show he has called The Oval. And I think, the way Tyler Perry is going to frame it is that, this is somebody who kind of infiltrated my inner circle and, now is trying to extort me. The accuser says he reported this to the EEOC and they didn't investigate it. That's not super uncommon. You're required to go to the EEOC to preserve your rights under the federal law. And it really depends on the office and how staffed they are and how overwhelmed they are, how much initiative they take, especially in sort of single plaintiff cases. So it's not totally, outrageous that the EEOC might not do very much while your case is there. And then, once a period of time passes, you can kind of pull it out and proceed with one of these lawsuits.
Yeah, I'm just double checking. So this was filed in Los Angeles Superior Court, which is the equivalent of Supreme Court in New York. It's a trial level court. Uh, Granted, Tyler Perry is a big name in Hollywood, but we know through some various organizations and social media connections, a handful of lawyers who practice in that jurisdiction, and that is a very plaintiff-friendly jurisdiction that is not afraid to give massive awards in both employment discrimination and sexual harassment and personal injury type cases. So probably not a great venue for him. If I were in Tyler Perry's shoes, I would not love that venue. I guess he's hoping that his name recognition is enough because he is taking the position that you said, which is, this is someone that I let into my circle and now he's trying to extort me. I, you know, I do think it's a little risky when a defendant comes out this early in a case and accuses someone of extortion uh, and all of these sorts of things, sort of like the guy's lawyer said, which is before you've necessarily seen all of the evidence. Now, I would assume that they had been aware of these text messages because if he actually sent them, he probably would have given them to his lawyer. Although, as we know, clients don't always give you everything. But this was reported basically a week after it was filed, so that means that probably Tyler Perry's folks haven't even formally responded through what's known as an answer. And in all likelihood, there's been no exchange of documents or, text messages or certainly not depositions at this point. So it's very early, but this is a very media friendly lawsuit. They love this kind of stuff. So it will probably get picked up pretty consistently throughout, I would imagine.
Yeah, and the only thing I wanted to add was there are certain jurisdictions where it's potentially required to put some kind of dollar amount in a complaint. In New York, you actually don't do that. So the $260 million, I mean, I don't even know where that number came from, is a little bit clickbait. I'm sure that in certain situations you just put in there are some types of cases in New York where you're supposed to put, like, for example, if you're suing the state of New York, where you are supposed to put some kind of mathematical calculation in there, and in which case we would put it at like the highest possible, um, you know, amount that you could ever hope to receive. But I think that 260 million is probably just, I'm not sure how they came up with that number, but I wouldn't take that to mean too much.
Agreed. That's an arbitrary number, especially when you're talking about compensatory damages. Assuming that's what it is, it's very hard to put a dollar figure on emotional distress and that sort of thing. I mean, maybe there's an allegation that his career was set back because of what happened, in which case, there might be a little bit easier to quantify. But we'll see. We'll keep an eye on this one. We'll follow up with it. But that's a good segue into the next story, which also puts a number on a lawsuit. That number is $11 million. And that is a couple from New York City who has filed a lawsuit against Scandinavian Airlines, seeking damages because the wife was burnt by hot coffee on a flight a couple of weeks ago, or at some point in April. So the couple was traveling from Copenhagen to Oslo, aboard a Scandinavian Airlines aircraft. And apparently the flight attendant spilled what they've described as excessively hot coffee onto her lap while attempting to serve it. She's 78 years old and sustained what she claims are severe injuries. I saw a photo of the scar, which was pretty nasty. And as we know, because I handle a fair amount of nursing home cases, a picture can, picture does say 1,000 words in a lot of cases, in terms of probably the inevitable reaction, which is being dismissive of lawsuits with the whole hot coffee thing. What do you think?
Yeah, and on the photographs, I mean, I think we've experienced this where a judge will see a photograph and basically look at the other attorney and say, like, you have to settle this case. No jury can ever look at this photograph. It's too disgusting. I remember my dad back in the day had a case where somebody got burnt from some kind of blast of steam out of a boiler, and it was like a man and it was his groin, and they blew the pickup to like the size of a billboard, and it was pretty nasty. But anyway, I mean, this is another case where, again, like $10 million, a little bit of an arbitrary number. That being said, we talked about this in a prior podcast that somebody just got a $50 million actual jury verdict against Starbucks for getting hot tea spilled on them. So maybe not totally beyond the realm of reality, when it comes to a severe burn. I don't know why the news is so like captivated by people spilling hot liquid on themselves, but these cases are always very newsworthy for some reason.
They are, and look, I think I mean they're one of their allegations, which seems reasonable to me, is that there's very specific standards for the temperature that coffee should be served at. So it would seem to me that you could set, if you run a company that's serving coffee in these scenarios, can't you set the temperature or get a setup that has a certain temperature and serve it at that temperature so you avoid these kind of things? I mean,
Yeah,
I
I mean,
feel like I
sorry.
feel like I can't, I'm not sure where it was, but I recently got a cup of coffee at a drive-through somewhere, and it was so hot that if it had spilled on me, it would have burned me. And it seems like something that should be easily remedied or avoided.
Yeah, and I think there's another Latin term that comes to mind, which is like the res ipsa, which is res ipsa loquitur, means the thing speaks for itself. And it basically is a legal concept that the event would not have happened in the absence of negligence. So it takes some burden off of the plaintiff of proving negligence, because it's just basically like what you just said. If the coffee is going to burn someone to that extent, then we can probably infer that it was too hot. I'm not saying that necessarily applies in these situations, but it seems to me that potentially these cases are worth so much money, not only because a burn is probably one of the more severe injuries for someone to deal with in terms of needing extra surgery and it just being sort of grotesque and painful. Like you said, at this point in time, there seems to be that there would be parameters to avoid this. And then I just noticed that the other piece of it, her husband has also made a claim, $1 million claim for loss of companionship. So I thought maybe you could explain what that is, what type of claim that is.
Yeah, so in New York, at least, when someone's spouse is injured from negligence, the other spouse can assert a claim in most cases for what's known as loss of consortium, loss of companionship support, and that relates really to the loss of like the personal connection between the two, along with any kind of financial um, and other support that the spouse provides. So, for example, if this person was burned in an area that, made it so that they cannot have intimate relationship with a spouse, that's an element of damages. Um, we don't always pursue those claims or advise clients to pursue those claims because in some cases it's not really practical and it sends the wrong message because I do think it can send a message that you are looking for um, a payday. But in cases where the spouse legitimately has the claim and the other spouse is not able to support them in one way or another, then we do assert those claims. But typically, as in this case, the value or potential recovery in those kinds of cases is significantly less than the primary underlying claim of the person who is actually hurt. So in this case, it's like a 10-to-1 ratio of what they're seeking for the person who had the coffee spilled on her versus her husband. So that's about what you would expect. But again, in most cases in New York, at least, we don't put dollar signs or dollar figures on the pleadings, so we wouldn't make that type of an allegation. Um, but speaking of hot coffee, as I was looking this up, there was also a recent case filed in April against Southwest Airlines by the parents of a 4-year-old in Utah who suffered second-degree burns when a flight attendant spilled boiling hot coffee on him. Um, and they also allege in the lawsuit that the flight attendants were unapologetic. So, and that,
That's
and
probably what made them file the lawsuit in the first place.
well, yeah, we talk about this in the context of medical malpractice cases. There's some statistics that say that in situations where physicians make a mistake and they are apologetic and they own it to the family, the incidence of medical malpractice claims is significantly lower. Now, I think that's actually something that's kind of hard to quantify, but that's a stat that's been cited to me throughout the course of my career, both when I was defending malpractice cases and now when we're on the other side of them. But it is something that probably doesn't hurt if you are apologetic when you make a mistake like that. Now, you know, some lawyers would tell you that you should never admit fault, which I get. But look, it goes back to what you said before, which is if you spill hot coffee on, especially a 4-year-old, you probably can't really defend that unless there was some turbulence that caused it or something like that.
Yeah, and I think even in some jurisdictions, like for medical malpractice, there's even sometimes a privilege that you would not be able to use the apology against them in a lawsuit. But yeah, I agree. I mean, sometimes it's just how a situation is handled that can, I mean, we see that in employment cases too a lot. Sometimes, somebody, the thing that makes them decide to pursue legal action is something that the employer easily could have avoided if with a little foresight, like, am I going to fire this person and then simultaneously prevent them from getting, unemployment, even though, those kinds of sort of more insulting sort of, you know, rubbing salt in the wound kind of things can sometimes be the catalyst for someone moving forward with legal action as opposed to just sort of moving on with their life.
I'm not sympathetic to Southwest Airlines. I've disliked Southwest Airlines for a long time, for a number
Was
of reasons.
Southwest the one that dropped it on the kid?
Yeah, their whole cattle call system was. very frustrating. But I think they actually got rid of it, and now they have assigned seats, so maybe it's getting better. But
Well,
um,
I feel like the flight attendants on those flights are usually like happy and nice. I don't know.
yeah,
Maybe
they're actually
I
generally
did a,
relatively
we flew
friendly.
on New Year's Eve once and they like turned the whole plane into like a party. Now, some people might have thought that was horrible, but it was
Yeah,
somewhat festive.
yeah. Well, look, given recent events in the airline industry, I think anything they can do to make it more enjoyable is probably a good thing.
Oh,
Um,
speaking of which, did you see the headline about the girl who sang the Moana songs for like 2 hours on a delayed, I don't know, I think it was Delta, which is usually my preferred airline. They couldn't land for some, like, I don't know if it was weather or the wind or something. So they literally circled for 2 hours. That would be a nightmare in and of itself. And then someone allowed like a child to go up and sing in the whatever, like the
oh,
loudspeaker.
and the
Yeah,
PA? Oh
yeah,
my
that.
God.
So people like this went viral. People had like a field day over it. They were like, this is everyone's worst nightmare. Like, you can never do something like this. That they were like, the parents should be in jail. Like, how did they allow this to happen? And then the poor kid is like shamed. I mean, we all know, like, anybody who has kids knows that they go through like a phase in life where they need to be like performing. And it's really up to the parent to be like, no, no one is interested in this performance right now. And they had to like they issued Delta issued like a very wishy-washy, like some sort of apology or at least acknowledgement that this happened. But I
Yeah,
was
if you
like,
talk
I
talk
might
about
sue an airline if that happens.
yeah, talk about emotional distress, having to listen to somebody sing a song from Moana for 2 hours while circling an airport. Oh my
Yeah. And
God.
I say this as someone who's very tolerant of children on planes because I am always seated next to either a kicking child or behind a kicking, in front of a kicking child, or someone who's coughing the entire time. Those are like my two people that are attracted to me on flights.
Well, it's like you said, I think the media loves these types of lawsuits, but kind of going back to what we've talked about in the past, these are examples of cases where people, I'm sure the comments are critical of people filing lawsuits over getting spilled with hot coffee, but it goes back to A, is there a very obvious and clear standard that should be applied in terms of like what is the industry standard for serving coffee on a flight or in this scenario? What's the temperature? And B, did they violate it? And C, was the person severely damaged, which it looks like they were. So this is, it goes back to what I say all the time, and which is no one is going to change the way they behave, companies in particular, unless they are held accountable. And this is how they're held accountable. So you can guarantee that Scandinavian Airlines is revisiting the temperature at which their coffee is served after this. So maybe it prevents it from happening again in the future. All right, one more topic that we wanted to touch on, which is relating to a series that we do known as Misleading Headlines of the Week. And this is actually from an article in the Wall Street Journal that I just read yesterday, which relates not to a misleading headline in the news, but misleading headlines from lawyers. And in particular, the title of the article is "Lawyers Market Big Me Too Verdicts, but Their Clients Struggle to Collect." And the article is long and detailed and well reported, uh, talking about a number of high-profile lawsuits brought by high-profile lawyers, where the lawyers got very large jury verdicts on behalf of clients, mostly in employment discrimination and sexual assault claims. Um, and the lawyers touted these verdicts all over the media, but the clients have yet to recover anything. And so, if there's a misleading part of it, it would be from the lawyers claiming that they got these huge results, but not actually getting anything for their clients. And this is something that if we talk to folks all the time, and I'm a big proponent of this, that you have to be very cautious if you are looking for a lawyer as to what you read online, because most of what you read is in some way, shape, or form either inaccurate or not applicable to your situation. And So in this case, a big part of the article talks about a number of lawsuits brought by, pretty prominently known media friendly lawyers, including Gloria Allred, against a company, uh, an online streaming company in Los Angeles that was apparently run by a guy named Alciviades Alki David, who was an heir to the Coca-Cola bottling fortune, and apparently is a billionaire. So there were a number of lawsuits against him claiming sexual harassment, and a number of civil judgments stemming from either verdicts or default judgments. I would assume verdicts, uh, totaling more than $100 million. And long story short is he hasn't paid a penny. But you wouldn't know that if you were looking around, because the websites and the media around these cases from the lawyers is all about how much the verdict was for. And the article is about how hard it is to actually collect it in these cases. Now, I have a bunch of thoughts on this, but I just wanted to see what your thoughts were initially because I've been talking for a while.
I think the Wall Street Journal must have it out for Gloria Allred right
Yeah,
now
I,
because
I thought the same thing. Yeah.
they wrote, so one of our last episodes we talked about a piece that they wrote about her where they interviewed a bunch of former clients who were upset and with, sort of the service that they received. And in that episode, we kind of defended her a little bit because reading, having the employment attorney sort of background, we were able to kind of read between the lines a little bit and recognize that some of the things that were being reported as sounding sort of surprising or untoward were really things that are pretty normal, like having a confidentiality agreement or something like that. This, like the way you're describing it, I feel like there's probably bits and pieces of that as well. I mean, I think it's, if you've taken a case to a verdict and you win a giant verdict, any lawyer is going to tout that on their website and in their advertising, regardless of whether you collect it or not, because winning the verdict is a win. There's little wins along the way in your case that are totally appropriate to celebrate, even if unfortunately for some circumstance your client doesn't end up with, money in their pocket, or it's more difficult to collect at some point. So I feel like, one of the reasons why we always say we sort of wanted to do a podcast like this was to kind of explain a little bit, like in these headlines and in these legal stories, what is actually newsworthy and what is really not that big of a deal.
Yeah, you're correct. But so there's sort of like two things going on. One is cases where the lawyers have gotten significant verdicts and have not collected on those. Okay, that's the first part. And to your point, we that has happened with us, right? Um, one of the earlier cases that I took to trial when we opened our firm was a case against a company that was doing asbestos removal. And we had a client who alleged that they were doing it illegally and endangering people by doing it that way. And the client got fired. So we sued the company and we took it to trial and we won. And the client never got paid because the company filed for bankruptcy and basically went out of business and there was just nothing to get. And so in those situations,
We didn't get paid either, by the
and we
way.
didn't get paid. Yeah, exactly. Because we had the case on a contingency fee, which is typically the case. And so we went through a whole trial, depositions, trial, everything, and didn't get paid. And so, um, but from our perspective, we won because we did what we had to do and we did all we could do, which is we got a jury to agree that he was illegally fired and award him damages because of it. So I get that piece of it. The other part that they're reporting on is apparently a number of cases where lawyers got really big jury verdicts initially that were later reduced by a judge, in one case from $900 million to $90 million. Now, look, $90 million is still a ton of money. That's a massive jury verdict. 900 is a lot more. And, so the Wall Street Journal is trying to say, well, this lawyer who is touting this $900 million verdict is is really misrepresenting it because it was reduced to $90 million by a judge. Now, technically, the lawyer's not doing anything because he's saying what the verdict was, which is what it was. I think the real tone of the article or the point of it is that people see this and they think that that's actually what the person got, when in reality, it's rarely the case. And this goes back to what I said before, which is, and I always tell people this, clients come to us and they say, well, I think my case is worth X number of dollars because I was looking online and I saw that there was a jury, a settlement for this much in Brooklyn and a jury verdict for this much in the Bronx and another jury verdict for this much in Queens. And I say, well, okay, first of all, you have to understand that where you are makes a huge difference in how much a jury awards, potentially. Upstate being much more conservative than downstate, generally speaking. And second of all, you have no idea what those cases ultimately settled for or what the verdict was reduced to, if anything, because in many cases there's a big jury verdict and a case is settled for something less because there's a prospect of an appeal or a judge will lower the amount because they feel that it's not fair. None of that gets reported on. And so I think kind of one of the points of the Wall Street Journal piece was to say, you really don't know what's happening here. And it's like goes back to what you said. We're trying to, one of the reasons we have this podcast is to try to explain this to folks, but it's a scenario where I always say if you're going to talk to a lawyer and ask them about, the numbers on their website, ask them what the real numbers are and see if they'll talk to you about it. That's it. No comment.
I don't have anything to add to that.
All right. Anyway, it's an interesting article. Long and the short is that I think, wait, to your point, I think the Journal has it out for um, Gloria Allred. She must have done something to upset them because this is the second what you might describe as a hit piece against her in the last
Yeah,
six
and I think
months.
her daughter's in there too, right? Her daughter is Lisa Bloom, and I
Oh yeah, okay, I forgot. Yeah, yeah.
mention her also. She hasn't gotten, I haven't seen her in the news quite as much because she had a little bit of a PR problem. She was one of the first people before it all shook out to not defend legally, but maybe like wrote a letter on his behalf, Harvey Weinstein.
Oh, this goes back to your letter.
That
Yeah.
did not obviously align with their brand of protecting women. And it was sort of before, that's like one of those things. And we've actually had this come up. I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but we've had this come up in our practice before where we typically don't defend cases in general, but maybe have had like a prior client or somebody like that come to us wanting us to defend maybe a sexual harassment claim or something like that. And that's probably one of the only areas where we have really like chosen a side on that we won't defend. And I think that is one of like her situation, I think is a good example of that because those cases are so sort of personal and fact specific. And just because somebody's nice to one person doesn't mean they're not disgusting with another person. Um, and it's just, I just feel like if you're going to pursue those cases on behalf of victims, that's one of those, I think, in my opinion, areas where you would not necessarily go on both sides of that. I think it's hard to defend some of those cases, acknowledging that I'm sure there's people out there who have been falsely accused. It's very hard to defend those kinds of cases without being sort of a victim blamer. And I think that, they had a big issue at that time when she sort of sent cease and desist letters to victims on his behalf. And then it turned out like, no, this man is a rapist.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important in those cases, and I think to your point, she was on the wrong side of it. I think Gloria Allred and some of the other lawyers referenced in that article, they have chosen a side, and even if the journal is sort of insinuating that they're misleading, these people have done a lot of good work. Gary Dordick, who's also referenced in the article, they've done a lot of good work for victims in their case, and mostly in Los Angeles and California, but they've gotten a lot of big verdicts, and those big verdicts do help, curb some of this behavior, and so, I think in that case it's good. They've chosen the side. So, anything else today?
There was just one other headline that I thought was worth maybe mentioning because we've talked about before, the difference between sort of criminal and civil liability. So it was reported this week that, so as we know, when President Trump came into office, one of his sort of day one things was that he pardoned everyone who was involved in breaching the Capitol on January 6th, including people who had been accused of, and even people who had pleaded guilty to assaulting people, as including police officers. I think, even people on both sides of, the political spectrum, some of did not really appreciate that because they thought that, people who had actually committed violence would not necessarily be included in these pardons. So, you're pardoned, you're not going to be, criminally prosecuted, or you're getting your somewhat of a clean slate on that. I think it's slightly more complicated than that, but in general, these people are not being criminally prosecuted for this anymore. And we've talked about it in various different contexts, like P. Diddy, and I think we talked about this with ASAP Rocky, where if the criminal system is not really going in favor of the victim for whatever reason, sometimes a civil lawsuit can step in. We always bring up O.J. Simpson as the example of that. The civil system can sort of step in to get some semblance of justice. So I don't know how many of these lawsuits exist out there at this moment in time, but the widow of a Capitol police officer sued one of the January 6th insurrectionists for wrongful death and assault because her husband, and I think this was like on body camera footage, was allegedly assaulted and then later took his own life. And I don't think he's the only police officer who took his life after this. So I think ultimately the wrongful death claim was dismissed because I think in general, and I actually, even as a plaintiff's attorney, have a little bit of a difficulty with this, making the link between something bad that has happened to you and suicide. I think that's like a pretty complicated type of situation, because obviously there's people who are bullied and people who are assaulted and have horrible things happen to them who do not ultimately take their own life. And I think it's difficult from a legal perspective to kind of make that link. However, he was ultimately found liable for the assault, and she was awarded $500,000 for that. So, nothing is going to make it right what happened here, but at least it's a little bit of accountability, in this context where people have really not received the sort of consequences of their actions that most people would in that type of situation.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a good example of the civil system working to right what I think is personally, wrong. But I have two comments. One, there are definitely situations where wrongdoing can lead to suicide, and does because someone is in a position where, some kind of a life-changing event happened because of someone else's negligence. And I personally have seen cases and been involved in cases where it has led to, the person's quality of life has diminished so significantly that they felt they had no choice. And I think in those cases, you can make that argument with a straight face. But it can be a hard argument to make. The other, I think obvious point, but maybe everyone doesn't know this, is that the burden of proof and the standard in a civil case is lower than it is in a criminal case. So it is, in theory, easier to prevail in a case a civil suit against someone for assault, for example, than it would be in a criminal case. Um, Not that that's necessarily applicable here because of the pardon situation, but something to keep in
And I
mind.
think,
And
oh,
that's what
sorry.
happened. That's what happened in the O.J. Simpson case.
Yeah, and just in fairness, I think that this particular defendant was not never actually criminally prosecuted because whoever would have been responsible for doing that at that time, I don't know if they thought there was enough evidence to move forward with that particular person. So I don't think that he's one of the people who, pleaded guilty or was
Oh,
actually convicted or something like that. But I think that also shows, the difference between criminal and civil. If a prosecutor is not necessarily going to move forward with a criminal case that they don't think they're going to, be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But in a civil context, your burden is a little bit lower. So, you can, go in there and put your evidence out there and, kind of see what happens. And, if the wrongful death case had not been dismissed, that would have been, you hate to talk about those kinds of super tragic situations in a dollars and cents perspective, but that would have been you would have seen a much higher number in that situation for sure.
oh, definitely. Yeah, that's where the economic loss is very significant. Um, Sad case. I'm sure there are others making their way through the pipeline. Statute of limitations is probably run in most states on those claims, but I assume some are in suit already. So this probably won't be the last. If we see other ones, we'll certainly discuss them because it is an interesting topic. All right. Anything else today?
No,
All right. Well, as always, thank you for listening. If you are enjoying the show, again, please follow the show on your favorite podcast platform. Leave us a good review, and the best thing you can do is share with a friend, get somebody else who might be interested to listen to the show. Uh, if you have questions and you want them answered, by all means, hit us up on Instagram or social media. And we will be back again soon talking about some more legal stories in the news. And thanks again for listening.